A Haunted House in the Middle of Nowhere. The Architect of Memory Part 1. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories are found in the spaces between what we plan and what life actually gives us. Sometimes they're written in the bones of old houses, in the soil of forgotten gardens, in the courage it takes to let someone see all your broken places and love you anyway. This is the story of how I learned that the heart, like any structure worth saving, requires both a solid foundation and the willingness to let in light. I thought I was here to save a house, but I didn't realize it was the house that was here to save me. The Hartwell estate had been rotting for 30 years when I first saw it. Rain dripped through collapsed sections of the roof, and ivy had claimed the east wing so completely that you couldn't tell where nature ended and architecture began. But standing in that overgrown circular drive, looking up at the skeletal remains of what had once been a magnificent Queen and Victorian, I felt something I rarely allowed myself to feel about a building. Heartbreak. "Are you sure this is salvageable?" Chloe asked, stepping carefully around a pothole that could have swallowed her entire designer boot. My sister had insisted on driving me out here from Boston, claiming she wanted to see what had me so mysteriously excited about a haunted house in the middle of nowhere. "It's not haunted," I said automatically, though something about the place did feel occupied. Not by ghosts, exactly, but by the weight of unfinished stories. And yes, it's salvageable. Look at those bones. I pointed to the wraparound porch, where despite decades of neglect, the intricate gingerbread trim still held its delicate patterns. The foundation was solid stone, and the basic structure, though damaged, remained sound. I could see it all in my mind already, the floor plan spreading out like a familiar map, each room connected to the next in perfect Victorian logic. "You and your bones," Chloe laughed, but there was fondness in it. "Most people see a ruin. You see a renovation project." She wasn't wrong. It's how I'd always been, even as a kid. While other children saw monsters and shadows, I saw load-bearing walls and structural possibilities. After Mom died, I'd spent hours drawing floor plans of imaginary houses where nothing bad could happen, where every room had a purpose and every door led somewhere safe. The Hartwell Foundation had hired me because of my reputation for impossible saves. I'd successfully restored 3 hopeless Victorian mansions in the past 5 years. But this project was different. This was my chance to prove I belonged in the same conversation as the legendary preservation architects, the ones whose names appeared in textbooks. "The landscape designer should be here soon," I told Chloe, checking my phone. "Then we can do the initial walkthrough." "Landscape designer?" Chloe raised an eyebrow. "Please tell me he's not some ancient man with grass stains on his khakis." I was about to respond when I heard the crunch of gravel behind us. We turned to see a dark green pickup truck pulling into the drive, and my breath caught in a way that had nothing to do with architectural appreciation. The man who climbed out was tall and lean, with salt and pepper hair that looked like he'd been running his fingers through it. He wore work boots and jeans that had seen actual work, and when he looked up at the house, his expression was reverent, like he was seeing something sacred. "You must be Juliet," he said, walking toward us with a slight smile. "I'm George Marion." When he shook my hand, his was calloused and warm, and I found myself noticing the way his eyes, a deep gray-green, seemed to hold secrets. Professional secrets, I told myself, about gardens and landscaping. "And I'm the sister who's about to leave," Chloe announced with a grin that told me she'd immediately sized up the situation and approved. "Juliet, I'll pick you up at 5, okay? That gives you plenty of time to discuss floor plans." I felt heat rise in my cheeks as she practically skipped back to her car, leaving me alone with George Marion and the weight of his attention. "Sorry about her," I said. "She thinks every professional meeting is a potential rom-com setup." "Is it?" he asked, and there was something in his voice, a gentle teasing that made my stomach flip in a way I hadn't felt in years. "Definitely not," I said quickly. "I don't mix business with anything else." Something shifted in his expression then, a subtle closing off that I might not have noticed if I weren't so good at reading the structural details of things, including people. "Good," he said, but it sounded almost like he was convincing himself. "Neither do I. Should we look at the house?" The next 3 hours changed everything. Walking through those ruined rooms with George was like seeing the place through completely different eyes. Where I saw water damage and structural concerns, he saw stories. He knelt in what had once been the conservatory, running his hands through the soil where exotic plants had once grown, and told me about the woman who had created this space, Eleanor Hartwell, the original owner's daughter. "She was a botanist," he said, his voice soft with something that sounded almost like grief. Ahead of her time, she cataloged over 300 native species on this property alone, but no university would accept her research because she was a woman. "How do you know all this?" I asked, crouching beside him in the dirt. The conservatory's glass dome had long since shattered, letting in decades of weather, but I could still see the elegant iron framework that had once supported it. "I research every property before I design for it," he said. "A garden should honor what came before, not just cover it up." He stood and brushed soil from his hands, and I found myself staring at the careful way he moved, like someone who had learned to be gentle with fragile things. "The house is the same way," I found myself saying. "It's not just about making it functional again. It's about understanding why it was built this way, what the original owners dreamed of when they planned each room." George looked at me then with an intensity that made me feel exposed, like he could see through all my professional composure to something underneath. "You get it," he said simply. We spent the rest of the afternoon mapping out the restoration plan. George would focus on recreating Eleanor's gardens while I worked on the interior, but our projects would need to complement each other perfectly. As we talked, I found myself sharing ideas I'd never voiced before, not just about the technical aspects of the restoration, but about what the house could become. A place where history lived and breathed again. "There's something else," George said as we prepared to leave. "The neighbor, Mrs. Hartwell, Eleanor's great-niece, she's been hoping someone would finally restore this place. She has boxes of Eleanor's papers, including her botanical journals. She might be willing to share them with us." "That would be incredible," I said, already imagining how those historical documents could inform every decision we made. "I'll arrange a meeting," he said, and then hesitated. "Juliet." "Yes. This project, it matters. More than just the architecture and the gardens. This place deserves to be saved." There was something raw in his voice that made me want to ask what he wasn't telling me. But before I could, Chloe's car was pulling up the drive and the moment passed. That night, I lay in my hotel room, sketching floor plans from memory, but my mind kept drifting to George. The way he'd touched the soil like it was precious. The careful distance he'd maintained even when we'd been working closely together. The sadness that seemed to live just behind his eyes. I found myself wondering about the shadows I'd glimpsed in his expression when he talked about Eleanor's story. There had been something too personal in the way he described her isolation, her regret over chances not taken. Most landscape designers I'd worked with approached historical projects with professional interest, but George seemed to carry Eleanor's heartbreak like it was his own. I pulled out my laptop and found myself researching him online, something I normally never did with colleagues. His website showed stunning gardens, all of them restoration projects like ours, all of them places where he'd worked alone. There were awards, glowing testimonials, but no personal photos, no glimpses into who George Marion was when he wasn't creating beautiful spaces for other people. The most recent project was from 3 years ago. Before that, his portfolio showed a different kind of work, collaborative designs, innovative modern landscapes, the kind of bold creativity that only comes from someone unafraid to take risks. But everything recent had been restoration, preservation, the careful tending of things from the past rather than the creation of something entirely new. I told myself it was just professional curiosity, but I knew I was lying. There was something about George that called to the parts of me I had spent years keeping carefully contained. The way he saw stories in soil and heartbreak in overgrown gardens made me want to share the secret dreams I kept locked away. The houses I designed in my mind that were about more than just historical accuracy. The spaces that could hold real love instead of just architectural significance. When I finally fell asleep, I dreamed of gardens growing through the rooms of a restored house and a man with gentle hands tending to them both. The next morning, I arrived at the site early, hoping to spend some quiet time with the house before George arrived. I'd always done my best thinking in the spaces I was trying to save, walking through them alone and listening to what they had to tell me. But as I pulled into the drive, I saw George's truck was already there. I found him in what had once been the library, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, staring up at the empty shelves. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air around him. "I hope you don't mind," he said without looking at me. I couldn't sleep, so I came to think about the gardens, among other things. I settled onto the floor beside him, leaving careful space between us. The library had been one of my favorite rooms during yesterday's walk-through. 2 stories tall, with a spiral staircase leading to a second-level gallery. The built-in shelving was intact, and I could imagine it filled with books again. "Eleanor spent a lot of time in this room," George said quietly. According to her journals, she would sit right here and sketch the garden plans. She could see the entire backyard from this window. "You've read her journals already?" "Mrs. Hartwell gave me copies last night." She was eager to share Eleanor's story with someone who would understand it. He pulled a leather portfolio from beside him and handed it to me. "I thought you might want to read them too. They're not just about botany. They're about dreams deferred, about love that couldn't be openly acknowledged, about the cost of keeping secrets." My fingers traced the worn leather cover. "What kind of secrets?" George was quiet for so long I thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Eleanor was in love with the groundskeeper's son, Thomas. He worked on the estate during the summers while attending university. Their relationship had to remain hidden because of the class difference. Her father would have disowned her, and Thomas would have lost not just his job, but any chance of finishing his education. Something in the way he said it made me look at him more closely. There was pain in his expression that seemed too personal for someone just retelling historical facts. "George, are you okay?" He stood abruptly, walking to the window and staring out at the overgrown gardens. "Eleanor made a mistake," he said, his shoulders tense. She thought she was protecting Thomas by keeping their relationship completely secret from everyone, including his own family. But her secrecy became a wall between them. Thomas felt shut out, like Eleanor was ashamed of what they had. The distance grew until Thomas couldn't take it anymore. What happened? Thomas left, got a scholarship to a university across the country, never knowing that Eleanor was planning to defy her father and run away with him. Eleanor had been saving money, planning their escape to somewhere they could be open about their love. But she waited too long to tell Thomas about her plans. By the time Eleanor worked up the courage to share her dream, Thomas was gone. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air seeping through the broken windows. And Eleanor never saw him again. Never. Eleanor spent the rest of her life creating these gardens, these beautiful spaces that no one would ever fully appreciate because she couldn't bring herself to share them properly. She died alone in this house, surrounded by beauty that felt empty because it wasn't shared with the person she loved most. George's reflection was ghostly in the window glass, and I could see that his jaw was tight with emotion. "That's heartbreaking," I said softly. "It is, and it's also preventable." He turned to face me then, and there was something desperate in his expression. Eleanor thought she was protecting Thomas by keeping secrets, by maintaining distance. But her secrecy was what destroyed them. The way he was looking at me, like he was trying to tell me something vital without actually saying it, made my pulse quicken. "George, what aren't you telling me?" For a moment, I thought he was going to answer. His mouth opened, and he took a half step toward me. But then he seemed to catch himself. "Nothing," he said, the professional mask sliding back into place. "Just, Eleanor's story is a cautionary tale about the cost of emotional walls." But I could see the walls he was talking about in his own posture, in the careful way he'd moved away from me, in the secrets hiding behind his eyes. The next few weeks fell into a rhythm that felt both natural and electric with tension. George and I worked in tandem, restoring the house and gardens with an intuitive coordination that surprised us both. He would mention a detail from Eleanor's journals, and I would find myself incorporating it into my restoration plans without even thinking about it. When I discovered original wallpaper patterns hidden beneath layers of paint, he would adjust his garden designs to complement the colors and motifs. But it was in the small moments between our professional collaboration that I felt the real connection building. The way George would appear with coffee exactly when I needed it most, somehow knowing exactly how I liked it without me ever having to ask. The way he would catch me when I stumbled while carrying heavy materials, his hands lingering just a moment longer than necessary before he stepped back with that careful politeness. I started finding excuses to seek his opinion on restoration choices that I could have easily made myself. Should we restore the original paint color in the morning room, or go with something that would better complement the garden views? What did he think about installing period-appropriate lighting fixtures versus more practical modern options? He would study whatever I was showing him with complete focus, standing close enough that I could count the flecks of green in his gray eyes, close enough to notice the small scar above his left eyebrow and wonder what story it held. But just when I thought he might say something personal, share something real about himself, he would step back into that professional distance that was driving me slowly insane. "You're overthinking this," he said one afternoon when I'd asked his opinion about 3 different doorknob options for the 3rd time. "Trust your instincts. They're excellent." The compliment warmed me more than it should have, and I found myself staring at him as he knelt to examine the original hardwood flooring. There was something almost meditative about the way George worked, like each task was a form of prayer or penance. "George, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why restoration?" I mean, most landscape designers I know love creating something completely new, but all your recent work is about preserving things from the past. His hands stilled on the floorboard he'd been examining. "Old things have stories," he said carefully. "They've weathered storms, survived neglect, endured things that would destroy newer construction. There's beauty in saving something that's already proven its worth. But what about creating something that's never existed before? Isn't there excitement in starting fresh?" George stood slowly, and for a moment his carefully controlled expression slipped. I saw something raw and painful before he caught himself. "Fresh starts are a luxury some of us can't afford," he said quietly, and then immediately looked like he regretted revealing even that much. We were creating something beautiful together, but the more time we spent in each other's company, the more I felt the careful distance George maintained. He would share insights about Eleanor's botanical work, but deflect any questions about his own past. He would stand close enough to show me a passage in the journals, close enough that I could smell his soap and feel the warmth radiating from his skin. But he never let the moment linger. It was driving me crazy. "You're falling for him," Chloe announced during one of our evening phone calls. "And he's falling for you, but something's holding him back." "We're working together," I protested. "It's professional." "Juliet, please. I've seen you work with male colleagues before. You don't come home from those meetings, sketching floor plans while humming." She was right, of course. I had been humming and sketching and finding excuses to stay late at the site just in case George needed to discuss some detail about the garden restoration. Even if I were interested, and I'm not saying I am, he's clearly not available emotionally. He keeps walls up that make my logical detachment look like warm openness. Maybe he has a good reason for those walls. Like what? I don't know. But Juliet, you've spent your whole adult life choosing safe, practical men who couldn't challenge your emotional barriers. This guy clearly affects you differently. Maybe it's worth figuring out why he's scared. That night, I found myself reading Eleanor's journals more carefully, looking for clues not just about the house and gardens, but about the kind of love that could survive secrets and separation. Eleanor's words were beautiful and heartbreaking. I thought I could love him safely from a distance, that my silence would protect us both. But love cannot thrive in shadows, no matter how carefully tended. Like the rare orchids I study, it needs the right conditions to bloom. Honesty, sunlight, the courage to be seen. I was still thinking about those words the next morning when I arrived at the site to find George's truck already there, as had become our pattern. But this time he wasn't in the house. I found him in the back garden, kneeling beside a patch of ground he'd been clearing for weeks. "Look," he said without preamble, his voice filled with wonder. I knelt beside him and saw what had captured his attention. Tiny green shoots pushing through the soil, dozens of them in careful rows that matched the garden layout in Eleanor's sketches. Are those Eleanor's orchids? At least some variety of native orchid that's been dormant in this soil for decades. The clearing and watering I've been doing must have triggered them to bloom. I stared at the delicate shoots, amazed. They've been here all along. Waiting for the right conditions, George said softly, for someone to care for them properly. He looked at me then, and the metaphor hung in the air between us like a bridge neither of us was brave enough to cross. "George," I started, but he was already standing, brushing soil from his hands. "I should check on the irrigation system," he said, back to that careful professional distance. I wanted to grab his shoulders and shake him. I wanted to demand he tell me what secret he was carrying that made him pull away every time we had a moment of real connection. Instead, I watched him walk away and felt the familiar ache of wanting something just out of reach. That afternoon, Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, the elderly neighbor who shared her great-aunt's name, finally accepted our invitation to visit the restoration site. She was a tiny woman with sharp eyes and silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, and she moved through the house like she was greeting old friends. "Oh, it's going to be beautiful," she said, running her hand along the restored banister in the main hallway. "Eleanor would be so pleased." "We're trying to honor her vision," I said. "The journals have been invaluable." "Yes, George told me you'd been reading them." Mrs. Hartwell paused at the entrance to the conservatory, where George had been working to restore the iron framework that would eventually support new glass panels. "I hope you understand. Eleanor's story isn't just about botany and architecture. It's about love and loss, and the terrible cost of keeping our hearts locked away." Something in her tone made me pay closer attention. This wasn't just historical commentary. Mrs. Hartwell looked at me meaningfully, then glanced toward the window where George was working in the garden, carefully transplanting the orchids that had begun to emerge from decades of dormancy. "Some people," she continued carefully, "repeat the same mistakes across generations, thinking they're protecting the people they care about. But walls that are built to protect have a way of becoming prisons." I felt a chill of understanding. "Mrs. Hartwell, is there something you think I should know about George?" The elderly woman sighed, settling into the chair I'd brought for her. She was quiet for so long, I thought she wouldn't answer. But then she spoke with the careful precision of someone sharing a burden she'd carried too long. "George isn't just interested in Eleanor's story because of the botanical aspects," she said. 3 years ago, he lost someone very dear to him, a young woman named Sarah who struggled with depression and anxiety, though she hid it well from most people. My heart began to pound, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. The careful distance George maintained. The way he talked about emotional walls like he knew their cost intimately. The sadness that seemed to live permanently behind his eyes. "George loved her deeply," Mrs. Hartwell continued, "but he had his own struggles, things from his childhood, fears about not being worthy of love. He thought he could protect Sarah by being strong and steady, by not burdening her with his own emotional complexity. He believed that love meant being a rock for someone, not showing your vulnerable places. What happened? I whispered, though part of me already knew. Sarah felt shut out of the most important parts of George's life. She was fighting her own demons, but when she tried to share them with him, he would give her practical solutions instead of emotional intimacy. He was so afraid of adding to her burden that he never let her carry any of his. Mrs. Hartwell's eyes filled with tears. She left him notes, dear. Notes that said she felt like she was loving a ghost, someone who showed up physically but never let her see his heart. She said she was tired of being alone in a relationship with someone who wouldn't trust her with his whole self. The room seemed to spin around me. She took her own life. Yes, and George has spent the last 3 years believing it was his fault, that his emotional distance and secrecy drove her to despair. He's been punishing himself ever since, taking only projects where he can work alone, avoiding any connection that might put someone else at risk of his damage. I thought about all the times George had pulled away just when we seemed to be connecting, the way he deflected personal questions, the careful professional distance he maintained even when I could see the want in his eyes. He thinks he's protecting me, I said, the words barely a whisper. And you, my dear, are probably letting him, because it feels safer than risking your own heart. Mrs. Hartwell's words hit me like a physical blow because she was absolutely right. I had been content to let George maintain his walls because they matched my own. We were both choosing the safety of distance over the risk of real connection, both too scared to be fully known by someone who might decide we weren't worth loving. But loneliness isn't penance, Juliet, Mrs. Hartwell continued gently. It's just another kind of death. And Eleanor's story, the real lesson of her life, isn't about the tragedy of lost love. It's about the tragedy of love that was never fully claimed, never fully risked. What should I do? Eleanor would tell you to tend the garden, dear. Love, like orchids, needs the right conditions to bloom. Sometimes that means being brave enough to clear away the old growth and make space for something new. That evening, I found George exactly where I expected to, kneeling beside Eleanor's orchids, which had grown noticeably even in the few hours since morning. They're beautiful, I said, settling onto the ground beside him. Resilient, he corrected. They survived 30 years of neglect. That's not beauty, it's stubborn hope. Maybe it's both. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. The house looked different from this angle, not like a ruin, but like a place that was remembering how to be home. George, I said, finally, Mrs. Hartwell told me about Sarah. He went very still beside me. She had no right. She was worried about you. About both of us, actually. There is no both of us, he said, standing abruptly. There's a professional collaboration that will end when this project is finished. Is that really what you want? It's what's safe. I stood too, moving closer to him despite every instinct that told me to respect his walls. Safe for who? Because I don't feel protected by this distance, George. I feel frustrated and lonely. You should feel grateful, he said, his voice rough with emotion. You should feel grateful that I'm not selfish enough to drag you into my damage. What if I want to be dragged? The question hung between us like a challenge. George stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him warring with himself. You don't understand, he said finally. I loved Sarah more than I thought possible, and I killed that love with secrecy and distance. I thought I was protecting her by not sharing my struggles, my fears, my past mistakes. I thought love meant being strong and steady and never letting her see my broken places. Tears were running down his face now, but he didn't seem to notice. But she needed all of me, not just the parts one thought were worthy of love. And when she tried to tell me she was drowning, I gave her empty reassurances instead of real intimacy. I was so busy being her rock that I forgot to be her partner. George! She left me notes, Juliet. Notes I was too scared to read until after she died. Notes that said she felt like she was loving a ghost, someone who showed up physically but never let her see his heart. She said she was tired of being alone in a relationship. I felt tears prick my own eyes, imagining the pain both of them must have carried. And now, he continued, I look at you and I want to share everything. I want to tell you about my fears and my dreams, and the way working with you has made me remember what it feels like to hope for something. But wanting that feels like betraying Sarah's memory, like I learned nothing from destroying the most important thing in my life. So you're choosing to repeat the same pattern, I said gently. You're keeping me at a distance to protect me, just like you did with her. George looked stricken. Yes. Yes, that's exactly what I'm doing. What if, I said, taking a step closer, what if the way to honor Sarah's memory isn't to avoid love, but to love better? What if she would want you to use what you learned from losing her to build something true with someone else? What if I can't? What if I'm too broken to love anyone properly? I reached out and touched his face, feeling the wetness of tears under my fingers. What if you're not? What if you're just human, and learning to love well is something we do together? For a moment, I thought he was going to kiss me. I could see the one in his eyes, the way he leaned slightly toward me. But then he stepped back, shaking his head. I can't, Juliet. I can't risk your heart the way I risked hers. You're not risking my heart, I said, frustration creeping into my voice. You're breaking it by refusing to trust me with yours. I saw the truth of that hit him like a physical blow, but he still didn't move toward me. I need time, he said quietly. Time for what? To figure out how to be someone worthy of what you're offering. George, you already are. But he was walking away, leaving me standing alone among Eleanor's orchids as darkness fell around the garden. The next few days were torture. George continued to work on the gardens, but he avoided any unnecessary contact with me. Our professional communications were polite and efficient, but the warmth that had been building between us was gone, replaced by a careful courtesy that felt worse than anger. I found myself watching him from the library windows, studying the way he moved through Eleanor's garden with reverent attention. He would kneel beside each emerging plant like he was tending something sacred, his touch so gentle it made my chest ache. This was a man who knew how to nurture beauty, who understood the patience required to help fragile things flourish. But he couldn't extend that same tenderness to himself. I threw myself into the interior restoration with an intensity that worried even me. I worked 16-hour days, staying at the site until long after George had left, losing myself in the details of crown molding and window casings, and the satisfying precision of historical accuracy. But even as I focused on the technical aspects of the restoration, I couldn't stop thinking about what Mrs. Hartwell had told me. George wasn't just carrying grief. He was carrying guilt that wasn't his to bear. He'd loved someone who was struggling with demons bigger than love could fix, and he'd blamed himself for not being able to save her. But love isn't about saving someone. It's about showing up fully, honestly, and trusting the other person to do the same. You're being ridiculous, Chloe told me during one of our evening phone calls. Both of you are being ridiculous. He's punishing himself for something that isn't his fault, and you're letting him because you're too scared to fight for what you want. It's not that simple. It is exactly that simple. Juliet, you have spent your entire life choosing safe over meaningful. Here's a man who clearly loves you, who you clearly love back, and you're both so terrified of being vulnerable that you're choosing misery instead of taking a risk. He doesn't love me. Please, I saw the way he looked at you. I heard the way your voice changes when you talk about him. This isn't about love, it's about fear. She was right, of course. But knowing something intellectually and having the courage to act on it are two different things. I'd built my whole life around careful choices, measured risks, the safety of things that could be planned and controlled. George represented everything I'd spent years avoiding, the messy, unpredictable, potentially devastating realm of real love. But as I sat in the restored library that night, surrounded by empty shelves that would soon hold books again, I realized something that changed everything. I wasn't protecting myself by maintaining distance from George. I was already in love with him, already vulnerable to the pain of losing him. The only choice I had was whether to love him fully or to let fear make my decisions for me the way it had made his. It was Eleanor's journals that finally gave me the push I needed. I'd been reading them every evening, finding comfort in her botanical observations and her careful documentation of the garden's seasonal changes. But that night, I found a passage I'd somehow missed before. I realize now that I have been gardening the same way I have been loving, carefully, safely, from a distance. I tend my plants with scientific precision, but I do not sit among them in the rain or lie beneath them in the sunshine. I do not let them surprise me or change me. I am so afraid of losing what I love that I never fully embrace it. Thomas deserves better than my careful affection. He deserves someone who will love him recklessly, openly, with the kind of passion that risks everything for the chance of real joy. I have been loving him like a botanist instead of like a woman, cataloging and categorizing instead of simply being present with his beauty. Tomorrow I will tell him everything. I will share my dreams of our life together, my fears about Father's reaction, my desperate hope that love can overcome any obstacle. I will love him without reservation or safety net, because that is what true love requires, the courage to be completely known. But there was no entry for tomorrow. Eleanor had written those words the night before Thomas left for university. I closed the journal and sat in the restored library, surrounded by empty shelves that would soon hold books again, and I understood something that changed everything. Eleanor hadn't lost Thomas because she loved imperfectly. She'd lost him because she'd waited too long to love courageously. The next morning, I arrived at the site early and went straight to the garden, where I knew George would be tending Eleanor's orchids. They had grown remarkably in the past week, and tiny buds were beginning to form on several of the stems. "They're going to bloom soon," I said, kneeling beside him. "Another few days, I think. George, I need to tell you something." He tensed, but didn't move away. "Juliet." "No, let me say this. I've been thinking about Eleanor and Thomas, about the choice Eleanor made to wait for the perfect moment to be vulnerable, to share her heart completely." I took a breath, steadying myself for what felt like the biggest risk of my life. I don't want to make Eleanor's mistake. I don't want to lose something beautiful because I was too careful, too scared to be completely honest about what I want. George was very still beside me, his attention focused on the orchids, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. "What do you want, Juliet?" "You," I said simply. "Not just the professional collaboration or the careful friendship. I want your messy, complicated, imperfect love. I want to know your fears and your dreams and the way you see the world when you think no one is watching. I want to sit with you in gardens you've created and watch seasons change. I want to fight with you about paint colors and makeup while covered in sawdust. I want to be the person you tell your secrets to, not because it's safe, but because it's real." He turned to look at me then, and I could see the war happening in his expression. "I want you to trust me with your broken places," I continued, "the same way I want to trust you with mine, because I am broken, George. I've spent so many years building walls around my heart that I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to want someone this much. Juliet, Sarah didn't die because you loved her imperfectly," I said gently. "She died because she was struggling with something bigger than love could fix alone. But that doesn't mean love isn't worth the risk. It means love, real, honest, vulnerable love, is even more precious because we know how fragile life can be." George was crying again, but this time he didn't try to hide it. "What if I hurt you the way I hurt her? What if you don't? What if we love each other well enough to weather whatever comes? I don't know how to love without fear anymore." "Then we'll learn together," I said, reaching for his dirt-stained hands. "We'll learn to love courageously, the way Eleanor wished she had loved Thomas. the way Eleanor's orchids are blooming now, openly, beautifully, despite 30 years of darkness. George looked down at our joined hands, then back at my face. "I want to," he whispered. "God, Juliet, I want to try." "Then try," I said. "Start by trusting me with one true thing." He was quiet for a long moment, gathering courage. When he spoke, his voice was shaky but determined. "I think about you constantly," he said. "When I'm working in the garden, I imagine you walking through it with me, seeing the plants through your historian's eyes and telling me stories about the people who might have sat in the same spot 100 years ago. When I read Eleanor's journals, I picture us growing old together the way she and Thomas never got to, tending our own garden and leaving our own love story for future generations to discover." My heart felt like it might burst. "George, I'm terrified that I'll mess this up," he continued, "that I'll retreat into my walls when things get difficult and leave you feeling as alone as Sarah felt. But I'm more terrified of letting fear make my choices for me again. So what do you choose?" He lifted our joined hands and kissed my knuckles softly. "I choose you. I choose us. I choose to love you as honestly and openly as I can, even when it scares me. Even when it scares me too? Especially then." And then he was kissing me, right there in Eleanor's garden with soil under our fingernails and tears on our cheeks. It was not a perfect romantic movie kiss. It was better. It was real and desperate and full of all the messy hope that comes with choosing love over safety. When we finally broke apart, the sun had risen fully, casting everything in golden light. The orchids around us seemed to glow with their own inner radiance, and I could see tiny blooms beginning to unfold on the nearest stems. "Look," I whispered. George followed my gaze and smiled, the first completely unreserved smile I'd ever seen from him. "Eleanor's orchids," he said, "blooming at exactly the right moment. Think she would approve." "I think," George said, pulling me closer. She would tell us that love, like gardening, requires patience and courage in equal measure, and that the most beautiful things grow when we finally create the right conditions for them to flourish. 3 months later, the Hartwell estate reopened as a museum and botanical garden. The restoration had been featured in architectural magazines, and the gardens were already being studied by botanists interested in Eleanor's conservation work. But for me, the real success wasn't in the professional recognition or the historical preservation. It was in the way George and I had learned to tend our own love with the same careful attention we'd given to Eleanor's house and gardens. The learning curve hadn't been smooth. George's first instinct was still to retreat when emotions got complicated, and my first instinct was still to analyze and categorize rather than simply feel. We'd had fights about design choices and paint colors, yes, but also about deeper things. About the way George would shut down when he felt overwhelmed, and the way I would retreat into professional mode when I felt too vulnerable. But we'd learned to fight openly, honestly, without retreating behind the walls we'd both used to protect ourselves. We'd learned that love wasn't about being strong enough to carry everything alone. It was about being brave enough to share the load. "The orchid exhibition opens next week," George said as we walked through the completed restoration during the opening reception. Eleanor's orchids had not only bloomed, but thrived, creating a stunning display that drew visitors from across the country. "Mrs. Hartwell wants to dedicate it to Eleanor and Thomas both." "That's perfect," I said, watching a group of visitors marvel at the restored conservatory. They would have loved seeing their story inspire something beautiful. George stopped walking and turned to face me. Even after months together, the intensity of his attention still made my heart skip. Speaking of inspiring something beautiful, he led me to the library, which was now filled with books on architecture and botany, with comfortable reading chairs positioned to take advantage of the garden views. The evening light, streaming through the tall windows, cast everything in golden hues. "I have something for you," he said, producing a leather portfolio from behind one of the reading chairs. "George, you don't need to." "Close your eyes," he said, and there was something in his voice that made me obey without question. I felt him press the portfolio into my hands, the leather warm and supple under my fingers. Open them. Inside the portfolio were architectural drawings, detailed, beautiful sketches of a house I'd never seen before. But as I studied the floor plan, I realized it incorporated elements from the Hartwell estate. The same wraparound porch, the same conservatory design, the same thoughtful connection between indoor and outdoor spaces. Yet it was distinctly modern, distinctly ours. "George, these are incredible. Whose house is this?" "Ours," he said quietly. "If you want it to be. I've been sketching ideas for a place where we could build our own life together, somewhere that honors what we learned from Eleanor and Thomas while being completely our own." I looked up at him, this man who had learned to love without reservation, who had taught me that the most beautiful structures were the ones built on foundations of trust and honesty rather than fear. "Are you asking me to move in with you?" "I'm asking you to build something with me," he said, stepping closer. "A house, a garden, a life. I'm asking you to marry me, Juliet. I'm asking you to take the biggest risk either of us has ever taken." The proposal shouldn't have surprised me. We'd been talking about our future together for weeks, but hearing the words still made my breath catch. This was George choosing courage over safety, choosing to trust me with not just his heart, but his dreams for our shared future. I thought about Eleanor, who had waited too long to be vulnerable, who had let fear make her choices. I thought about the orchids that had waited 30 years for the right conditions to bloom. I thought about all the careful, safe choices I'd made in my life, and how none of them had ever made me feel as alive as I felt standing in this restored library with this man who saw beauty in broken things and had taught me to see it in myself. "Yes," I said, surprising myself with how easy the word was to say. Yes to all of it. The house, the garden, the life, the risk. Yes to choosing love over safety. Yes to building something together that's never existed before. When George kissed me this time, it was different from that first kiss in Eleanor's garden. This wasn't desperate or fearful. It was joyful, certain, full of all the promises we were ready to keep to each other. "There's one more thing," he said when we finally broke apart, his forehead resting against mine. "I've been thinking about what Mrs. Hartwell said, about honoring Eleanor and Thomas's memory. What would you think about opening our future home for tours once a year? Not as a museum, but as a living example of how love can create something lasting and beautiful." I smiled, thinking about the house in the drawings, imagining it filled with laughter and visitors and the kind of love that wasn't afraid to be witnessed. "I think Eleanor would love that," I said. "I think she'd love knowing that her story helped inspire something she never got to have herself." As the reception continued around us, George and I stood in Eleanor's library planning our future together. Outside the windows, the gardens we'd restored together bloomed in the evening light, and somewhere in the conservatory, Eleanor's orchids continued their patient, beautiful work of turning darkness into something magnificent. Later, much later, I would realize that the real restoration project hadn't been the house or the gardens at all. It had been learning to trust love with the same precision and care I brought to preserving historical buildings. Understanding that some things are worth saving not because they're perfect, but because they're real, because they've weathered storms and survived neglect and still have the capacity to shelter something beautiful. The Hartwell estate stands now as a testament to the power of patient restoration. But for me, it will always be the place where I learned that the most important architecture isn't about the structures we build to keep things out. It's about the courage to build spaces that let love in. Stay positive always, and thank you for listening to my story.
If this story touched your heart, please hit like and share it with someone who needs to believe in second chances. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need them most. Subscribe for more true love stories that will restore your faith in happily ever after. And tell me in the comments, have you ever found love in the most unexpected place? Next week, a grandmother's hidden letters reveal a 70-year love story that changes everything her granddaughter thought she knew about forever love. You won't want to miss it.